Now I know what some of you guys are saying. What's up with reviewing something that you made yourself? Well, I just figured, why not? Basically, I know a lot of people are interested in doing this. A lot of people have done this before. And so I thought I'd tell you not only how I did it, but also how it's worked out so far. So the reason a lot of people go with a DIY setup is they're riding in the winter, they know they want studs, and then they go to look at the price of studs and they realize that a studded tire can cost, $120 a piece, especially in something this size. Some of the smaller ones are less, but they're still pretty darn expensive. And considering you can get a pair of tires for 15, 20 bucks on the budget end, and then, you can spend 20 bucks on studs, it's pretty tempting. So I'm going to go over the pros and cons of why you may or may not want to go with a DIY studded setup. So first off, I'll tell you just how I did this. If you look closely, these are sheet metal screws. So I went down to Ace Hardware. You can go to any hardware store and go pick up some sheet metal screws. The dimensions that I decided to go with are 8 by a ½ inch. So 8 is the gauge of the screw. That's how big a round it is. I decided to go for an 8 rather than a 6 or a 4. I just felt like it would be a little bit sturdier and last a little bit longer. And then I went for a ½ inch because it was basically the shortest screw I could find. Quarter inch could work as well, but I do feel like the ½ inch has enough screw poking out that it should last. First, I took a drill bit and I drilled a hole through one of the tread knobs so that I would know where to start from the other side. That's what a lot of people have recommended, and people have been using that method for a long time. And then after I drilled all the holes, I went back through and I went ahead and drilled the screws through the same holes. And that's how I was able to get them to be so centered in the tread. That didn't work out every time. There's a few that got off of their track, but for the most part, out of the 215 screws per tire, I would say 95% of them or 99% of them really are in the right spot. I would say the major downside of this setup in general is that it took me more than 3 hours for the first tire, just because I was figuring it out. And then it took me probably 2.5 hours for the second one. And between everything else that was going on that day, really it was an all-day project. So if you have more money than time, this is probably not something you want to do. If I was to count up the amount of hours that I spent on this and converted that to what I could have been making it work maybe, then definitely not worth it. If, however, you aren't going to be working anyways that day, you have maybe have a day off, then it can definitely save you some money. From the other reviews I've read, people I've talked to, it does seem to take that long, kind of regardless of who it is. It just takes a ton of time. The pattern I decided to use, the pattern is really going to be up to you. There's tons of different ways you could pattern this. A lot of them are going to depend on your tire. I felt like I really needed a good outside row, and then I decided to go for an inside row so that I would be able to use the studs for braking. Some people just want them for cornering, but I really felt like I wanted them to be able to slow down in a controlled manner. So these studs out here on the side almost never touch the ice. I really have to either be going through some deep ruts in the ice, which is pretty common, or I'd have to be really leaned over, and I just don't feel comfortable doing that. So these studs do the majority of the work, and these are kind of backup, and they also help with some of that uneven ice as well. Even people at the bike shop were skeptical that I would be able to set these up tubeless. They thought I'd have to use like a pound of sealant, and when I posted pictures of these tires when they were completed, people said, are those set up tubeless? People know that I set up my tires tubeless. I'm from Arizona. I've kind of gotten into that habit, and it's kind of controversial in the touring world, and a lot of commuters don't do it. I love it. Maybe I should do a whole video on it at some point, but I actually did set these up tubeless. I set them up with orange seal, and I only used the recommended like 4 ounces of sealant per tire, which is what I use normally. I had a little bit of sealant coming out around a couple of these, but actually the screws were almost sealed on their own. I used a tapered head on the screws. There's different heads you can buy. Some of them are flat. The ones that I got were a little bit tapered as you go into the head of the screw. And so they actually seal into the tire pretty well. And the sealant took care of any other minor leaks very quickly. They've been set up like this. I haven't pumped any air into them in the past 2 weeks. And so they've actually done really well. If you were to put a tube in these, you would need to line it with either another tube or cover the heads of the screws in duct tape or a tire liner or something like that. That's usually a step that people mention. I did not have to do that. I just put the screws in, I put in sealant like normal, and I filled them up. And I actually feel like that's a better way to do it if, of course, you have the right equipment to start with, because you are putting a giant hole, 215 holes in this tire, and that could potentially weaken the structure of the tire. Some people have complained about that. Most people that do DIY tubeless have never had a problem. But I do feel like the sealant helps to glue all that damage back together a little bit better. So I felt really good about doing that. As the bike sits on its own, just under its own weight, none of the screws are really touching the ground on a hard surface. It can roll along without anybody on it and really not tear up the carpet or tear up the flooring or anything like that. But as soon as you put weight on it, this section pushes down, and that inner row really bites into whatever's on the ground. So it makes a ton of noise on the asphalt. It adds a ton of rolling resistance, and it bites into the ice really well, and you can really hear it chewing up the ice as you go along. So far, it's made a huge difference in control. I can go around corners without sliding. I can go over really off camber sections of ice that otherwise might have made the bike slide out from underneath me, and I can really slam on the brakes. And the bike will skid eventually, but it skids at about the same time as it would if, you were on pavement or something. So it's a lot of braking power. And then additionally, when it does skid, it skids in a straight line, whereas without studs, the back tire would want to fishtail out from underneath you. So it has added a ton of safety. It does add a ton of rolling resistance, especially with this really aggressive tire that I had. But I'm getting to where I'm going about twice as fast as normal in these conditions, just because I have so much more control. I don't have to slow down as much. I can get started easier, so I can cross streets sooner. And for me, that's huge. I've put quite a few miles on these tires so far. Right now, we've got this weird situation where there's a fair amount of asphalt on the road, and then these huge quarter-mile long sections of just solid 3-inch sheets of ice that just for some reason have not been cleared up by the city. And so the studs have seen quite a bit of asphalt time and quite a bit of ice time, kind of a 50-50 match even. They're definitely not on ice 100% of the time. But even after a couple of weeks of riding, these are still pretty sharp. They're definitely duller than these screws on the outside, and they're not tearing anything they come into contact with like they were when they were new. I mean, if you brushed up against these tires when they were new, they'd cut your pants open, and I mean that literally. They were extremely sharp, but they are still quite aggressive. They still bite into the ice very well. They are going to wear down faster. So if you're looking at doing a DIY or buying studs, the commercial studded tires are coming with a carbide stud. It's going to last a lot longer. It's not nearly as sharp. And it's just as effective. The rolling resistance on those studs is also less, so that's why you see a lot of those studded tires with studs in the center tread. So they should be more effective, although I think these longer studs are going to do better in certain situations as well. So the real question is, would I do it again? Oh, man, that is such a tough question. I did save quite a bit of money, but I don't think these are going to last as long, nearly as long as a pair of commercial studded tires. So I'm definitely going to use them for a few seasons. I'm going to use them as long as I can. And then when they do wear down, I'm probably going to get a commercially studded tire. Maybe a 45 North. That's about the only company right now that's making a tire in this size that's studded. So it's a tough question. Definitely saved a lot of money, but it was a ton of work, and it's going to be a higher maintenance cost, definitely. So tell me what you think. If you've done this before, how it's done for you, and what tires you're using if you're using commercially studded tires. If you have any questions about how I set it up, or would like to actually see how it's done, I could certainly post a video of a little tutorial of how I actually put the screws in. But I mean, I've ridden 2 winters without studs and gotten along with only one minor crash. And honestly, I don't think I would go back to doing it without studs. It's just, I got along, but it was nerve-wracking a lot of the time, and there were some major risks that I knew I was taking. I would say, if you don't have the money for commercially studded tires, take a day, go ahead and set up a pair of cheap tires. It's going to cost you maybe 60 bucks total, maybe a little bit less, and it's going to make you a whole lot safer.